All right, I have my Pantone postcard. I'm putting a little clear gesso on it so that my gouache will stick to it better. And I'm just doing a layer and then letting that dry. And then you can do a second layer if you like and let that dry. And that will just seal that up. But since it's clear, the color will still show through. You don't want to put white gesso on there. You want to make sure that it's clear so that your color, the background color, will show through. You're going to let it dry. Then you can put another coat on there. You can even sand it down just with some extra fine sandpaper once you're finished, because it will have a texture to it. Once that's dry, I'm going to tape off the word Pantone so that the paint doesn't go below that line and it stays nice and neat. And this is like a deep bluish gray. The number is 5405, as you can see. And then I have taken some chalk, and I think it was a pastel pencil, and I just drew on my little duckling. I'm going to start with the eye like I always do. I love to start with the eye of animals or people, whatever I'm doing, because once I get that established, I feel like I'm just looking at them. And if we haven't met, I'm Viv. This is Art with Viv, and welcome on in. So now I'm just going to do a layer of some browns, a lighter brown toward the middle of his little head, and then a darker brown on each end, and then across the back side of his little head. He is the cutest little duckling. I'm using my golden maple detail brushes. I love these brushes for gouache. I bought them for watercolor, but they have quickly become my go-to brushes for gouache. And since I'm using them to paint on these tiny postcards, so I need the little small detail brush. They feel better in my hand because they have that sort of bulbous. They have like a little bulb on the actual handle, so it feels better. I have arthritis in my hand, so that bulb makes it easier for me to grip onto. I really like them. I like the way that they release the paint onto the paper. They hold plenty of paint, and they have a really nice, precise tip that I like. So now I just taking that brown, I'm putting some lighter browns where the highlights are. Then I took more of a red brown and gotten into those darker, shadowier areas. Now I'm taking a really like a burnt umber. It's really just some burnt sienna mixed with a blue paint to make a really deep brown for those shadows. And the shadows are important. You got to get your shadows in. I've told you over and over, if you followed me even for a minute, it is actually the light and shadow that creates the realistic form of whatever you're painting. So you want to try to get the shadows, the values correct. And the value is just how light or dark something is. Color doesn't matter. You can paint this in purple and still make it look like a realistic duck that's just painted purple, as long as you do it with the correct tones and values. And so that's what I'm working on here. I'm trying to get in those darker shadows with that darker brown. And then, of course, the mid-tones are more of my burnt sienna. And then the lighter tones will come later. I'm letting that dry. As that's drying, I'm coming in here and getting some of those fluffy yellow markings put in. And you see I'm just using the tip of my brush and just doing sort of some scumbling type I guess that's brush strokes, some scumbling type brush strokes where you're just sort of doing scratchy little peckish. You can call them peckish. I'm just pecking at the paper with my brush. And those are a little bit deeper yellow, so I'm adding some of that deeper, richer, warmer yellow in the darker spots, and that pale yellow that has been mixed with white in some of the lighter spots for the highlight. Getting his tiny little chest done, coming back in with the lighter yellow just to make sure that I get some of that highlight in there. And then on his face, his cheeks, I'm still doing that sort of scumbling type brush stroke technique. If you're on my Patreon, or even if you follow me here on YouTube, this past week I did a bunch of different gouache stuff in my Patreon, and that was one of the techniques we talked about, was scumbling. And so you can see a good example of it here as I'm trying to make it look like feathery texture. And I'm just using like the tip of my brush just to sort of peck at the paper, scratch at the paper, make these little scumbly type paint strokes. And of course, I don't want the lines to be solid. I want them to look feathery, so I'm making sure that I don't do a straight, even line. I'm making sure that they overlap into the darker areas of the little bird, of my little sweet duckling. You don't want straight edges here because it wouldn't look natural. Now I've got a really deep sort of a yellow ochre, and I'm doing that under his chin. And I decided it needed to go a little bit darker, so I went in with and got some more of that burnt sienna type brown and mixed it with the yellow ochre so that it would have a nice shadow. Now we're going to work on his bill. The bill is by far, to me, the most complicated part. It has a lot of different highlights and shadows and colors, and they're all coming together. So that is the most difficult part, is that tiny little beak of his. And I've filled it in with sort of a mid-tone gray, and then on the tip I put some black, and then he's got a little bit of an orange right there that where his beak connects to his face, so I put that in. So I'm just trying to really look at the shapes of each one of these shadows and highlights, trying to get them, you know, to match the shapes and also to match the value, which is the lightest or darkness of something. And I'm adding a little bit more orange. I'm really trying to just get those shapes and get those values in correctly, and that's going to give me a more realistic looking beak. The thing I love about gouache is while it's wet, you can add more colors, different colors, and blend it while it's wet. Unlike watercolor, which you can do that, but at some point it becomes muddy and it just runs all into each other and becomes one solid color. But gouache can, you know, it can hold the different colors on its own, whereas the white, you know, it stayed white right there at the very bottom of his top beak. Even though I was mixing in a little bit more gray, it didn't all bleed together and become one solid color. That's what I'm trying to say. So now I'm going to do some little feathery marks down his back with a lighter color brown. The light is shining on his little back feathers, so they're a little bit lighter, and some of that light is shining on through them and just really catching those so they look almost like little individual hairs, little fuzzies coming off of his back. I'm also letting some of that background color shine through to give it a little bit more of a realistic look. And now I am just doing the same thing across his head, giving him some lighter feathers across the back side of his head where that light is hitting them. I'm going even lighter down his back with some really light feathers, and I've just added yellow and white to the brown to get that really light feathery look. You could probably do it with the straight yellow if you wanted, and it would kind of blend in. I don't want to do that though. I love ducks. I had some pet ducks when I was an adult. One of my boyfriends gifted me 2 little ducks, and I loved those ducks. They stayed in the house with me and they imprinted on me, so everywhere I went they came with me. They even got in the bathtub with me. They followed me everywhere, and I loved those little ducks. But eventually, you know, they outgrew my house and they really needed to be somewhere where they could make a family. So I found a nice lady. She had this beautiful pond. It had some ducks on it already, so she took them for me, and I would still go visit my ducks. I just didn't dump them off. I'd still go visit them and see how they were, but they lived a long, happy life on that little pond, and that little lady was so happy to have them, and they were happy to have their own little pond. So yeah, I've had so many different kinds of animals in my life. My mama used to call me Ellie Mae, like Ellie Mae Clampett, because I hope you didn't hear that. They're watching football in the other game, and they're just like clapping every time they get a score. Anyway, from the Beverly Hillbillies, so that's why she called me that, because Ellie Mae was always collecting animals. Anyway, I'm still adding some more of the highlights, and I'm letting the layers dry in between, but I'm also, some of the layers you can put directly onto a semi-wet layer if it's like the same color family. If it's not too wet, it won't blend in. It won't like sink down into it. So you just experiment and kind of find your groove and find what works for you as you're doing your gouache. Now I'm adding a little bit of a warmer yellow across that darker sort of yellow ochre, yellow brown color. So he is coming together pretty well, and I'm just doing those single little sort of strokes to make it look like feathery texture, darkening it up with that warm yellow in some of the shadow areas, and just building up the layers. That is the thing I love about gouache, is you can build up the layers, but you can also reactivate it with water, so that if I need to make a correction, I can just wet it down and sort of dab it up and then repaint that area. And you can, do sort of a more surgical type correction when you do that. You can do it right in one single area, more exact. So I really like that property of it. I'm adding some more details on the beak. I added some white highlights right in his little nostril, right across the top part of his bill, that upper bill. I put a white, it's almost pure white highlight there. I'm adding some more highlights on his feathers into that darker area on him, and that just gives him some texture, a little bit more dimension. It's starting to make him look more realistic, and it's also giving him a little bit more of a value change, so that he has, a greater range of values on his little fuzzy body. It's not just 3 dark, medium, and highlight. We've got, subtle shifts, and that's what's helping with those subtle shifts, is just doing these strokes of a different color into the body. Like this is a really dark brown. I've just mixed a little brown with blue, and I am just adding some deep shadows in there now. Usually you work from dark to light with gouache. You put the dark layers down first and then layer up, or at least that's how I do it. I think other people go light to dark. On this one, I am going sort of mid-tone to light, and now to the really darks. And that's another thing I love about gouache, is it's so forgiving. You can go from lights to dark, from dark to lights, and it's perfectly fine. You're not going to get too messed up doing that. I mean, unless it's just some big mistake you make, which it's all fixable. You can always paint over it. So my duck is looking pretty good. He needs a few more highlights, so I'm coming in there around his eye, putting some really pale yellow, and that's just lemon yellow mixed with the white gouache for those really light highlights, those really light yellows. He is really starting to come along. I'm liking him. But I could paint ducks all day. I could paint ducks probably every day of my life and be happy. I just love them. I don't know what it is about ducklings and ducks that fascinate me, but they just do. Again, I'm adding some more of a different color, like a lighter, paler, more beigey type brown on top. Again, just adds more dimension, more texture, and it adds another value. It's another change in value that's very gradual and subtle, but it really makes a big difference. It's those little things that you really need to watch out for, and that's the little things that really make your artwork pop, like the highlights, the really deep shadows. Those are the things that actually bring it to life. All the other stuff is window dressing to a certain degree. So I'm going to do some more highlights across his little head. I did a little highlight down the front of his beak. I'm darkening up some of those areas as well, just to kind of clean up the edges. Right around his eyes, I'm getting that marking on his eyes a little bit darker. Just adding another layer of color to it and another layer of value to it. I'm just going to start with some light blue on this background. I'm going to try to use the actual color of this card as the darker, shadowy areas. So I'm going to go in here with sort of the mid-tone. It's a light blue, but it's really sort of a mid-tone blue, because I'm going to come back in with some lighter blue. And you see I'm trying to kind of make jiggity-jaggedy strokes right there around the fur, so that I don't lose that fuzzy look. So I am cutting into the feathers. Well, it does sort of look like fur. Cutting into the feathers with some of those blue strokes so that I don't lose my fuzzy look. Notice I'm not painting like a straight line around his back. I'm letting those areas be fuzzy. And I'm just trying to get some of the highlights and the shadows and reflections in the water as I see them from the reference photo. And we're just going to go around his body with a lighter little reflection. I am not trying to get too precise with this. It doesn't need to be perfect. I just want to give that look of reflection in the water. And I'm just mapping those out, again, with just whatever shapes I see in the reference photo. And I'm doing my best to try to, make it as close to the reference as possible, but you don't have to copy the reference. There's no point of that. And there's some more highlights behind his beak, which that will also bring the darkness of his beak out. When you paint light next to really dark, it really makes that dark stand out. Or opposite, if you paint the dark behind a light, it'll make that light really stand out. So that is contrast. Contrast is a principle of design and art. And I am using it to my advantage there to pull that beautiful dark beak out. Before, it was very close to the same value as that dark blue background, but with that light blue paint under it and around it, it really brings that beak out and makes it more of a focal point. So be thinking about that when you're planning your art, putting darks next to light and how they affect each other. Also, colors affect each other. Whenever you put any kind of complementary colors close together, they make each other brighter and more vibrant. Hence, you'll see that blue really makes that orangey yellow in the bird and my little duckling stand out. So yeah, there's lots of things to be thinking about when you're planning your painting, and as you're painting, there's just lots of little principles to guide you that really, really help you make a better composition and a better, more exciting visual opportunity for your viewer. That's what I'm gonna say. It's a visual opportunity. Heck yeah. I'm gonna write that down. I like that. Visual opportunity. We giving our viewers beautiful visual opportunities. Admirers of our art. All right, yeah, sometimes I crack myself up. Now I'm doing a little bit of his reflection. So I'm just really lightening up some of the colors that are in his feathers, some of the markings, and I am putting them down into the water, but they're more watery. They're more of a liquidy type of consistency, and they have a little more white in them. You can even put a touch of blue in them to gray them down some, because that blue, the blue reflection from the sky, is going to affect the color just a little bit. And notice I'm not like painting another duck into the water, so that because the water's not still. If the water was still, it would be his reflection, and it would be almost like painting a second duck, in the water. But this water is moving. It has movement and some energy to it. So his reflection in that water is broken up into little parts. So I'm just doing it in little shapes. I'm just breaking his reflection up into those little shapes. How you see it as the light hits it and the water rises and falls makes a big difference. So I just wanted to point that out to you. I am not trying to make an exact replica of the duckling in the water, because this water is moving and it would not look realistic. And we want to capture that energy of the water moving and of him sort of gliding through the water. Now I'm putting in some more shadows with the darker brown into the water and right underneath the duckling. I like how he's coming out. He is so cute. Now I'm doing a little bit more of a darker blue in some of those areas to make it even darker than the actual background. And I'm going to continue back in the background up toward the top and just keep on working on my ripples in the water. I've changed to a bigger brush, and I'm going with a much, much, much lighter blue. It's got a lot more white in it. There's a big reflection up there, so I'm just trying to get that. And I'm just paying attention to the shape of it and get that shape in there. And then on some of my blue, my mid-tone blue, I'm coming back in with that really pale blue to add some highlights. And that just makes it look a little more realistic. And again, the paint is still a little bit wet, so those blue highlights will blend right into that medium blue if I need it to. But yeah, I'm trying to make sure that I use that background, the background color of the actual postcard, as my dark color. Now I'm adding a little bit more light colors around his face again. That is making that pop out. I'm adding some more highlights into those mid-tones. And that just gives them more dimension, makes them have a little bit more energy. Really pretty. I really like this little duckling. Yeah, I think he came out pretty good. We're almost done with him. Just adding more highlights here and there. Lightening up some of these areas. Giving it a little bit more depth and trying to capture some of those reflections, the shapes of the reflections I see in the water. I really hope that you give gouache a try. I have fallen in love with it over this past year. It is really a forgiving medium. I don't really know why it is not more popular, but you know, here we are. It is becoming one of my favorites. I don't know, I like them all, but gouache is just so easy and so forgiving. So any beginner, I would suggest you try gouache before you try watercolor, and see how you like it. And it's really sort of like acrylic, except for acrylic, once it's dry, you can't reactivate it. So once you make a mistake, you actually have to paint over it. You can't pull the paint back up and repaint it. You have to paint over it, which you can paint over it in gouache too, but I just like the ability to be able to actually wipe up the paint and redo it if I need to in that one spot. So there you go. We have got this cute little duck. Thank you for watching. If you want some bonus content related to my YouTube channel, then consider joining Patreon. And those are my 3 little ducklings that I have done so far. All right. Thanks for watching. Love y'all. And thanks to all my patrons. I cannot do this without you.